Good morning. It's my honor to chair this session. I'm Xiaojun Wang from Peking University. And please allow me to introduce our first speaker, Noam Slonim. Noam is a distinguished engineer at IBM Research AI. He received his doctorate from Hebrew University and held a postdoctoral position at Princeton University. He received Best Paper Awards in ECR and UI and got Presentation Award at CIGAR. He joined IBM Haifa Research Lab in 2007, and in 2011, he proposed to develop Project Debater, and since then, he has been serving as the principal investigator of the project. He published more than 60 publications and focused on advancing the emerging field of the computational augmentation. Please join me in welcoming Noam Slonim. His talk is about Project Debater. He will tell the story behind the project. Welcome, Noam.
Thank you. So I think I will start until they connect the computer. So thank you for the introduction and thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here and to be able to speak to all of you this morning. It is not always the case that we can identify the trigger that led us to pursue the research questions that we are pursuing. I'm from Israel, where debating is common. And I grew up in a house that brought this notion to the extreme. And still, I grew up, apparently, and joined IBM Research at some point. And in IBM Research, we have this interesting tradition of grand challenges. Back in the 90s, IBM introduced Deep Blue that was able to defeat Garry Kasparov in chess. In 2011, IBM introduced Watson that defeated the all-time winners of the TV trivia game Jeopardy. And just a few days after this event, an email was sent to all the thousands of researchers in IBM across the globe, asking us what should be the next grand challenge. I was intrigued by that, so I offered my office mate at the time to brainstorm together, and this is what we did. We met in the office in Tel Aviv for brainstorming. As some of you may know, brainstorming sounds like a cool and enjoyable activity until you actually start. And then sometimes it is not really a storm of ideas. It is more like a faint wind of vague thoughts that should not be mentioned elsewhere. This meeting was not much of an exception, but at some point towards the end of the meeting, I don't recall the exact trigger, I suggested this notion of developing a machine that will be able to debate humans. And that this is how we will demonstrate it through a full live debate between this envisioned system and an expert human debater. And this sounded better than all the other thoughts that we had up to that point, so we decided to submit that. The only guidance that we got was to submit the proposal in a single slide, so the management will not be swamped with too many details. And we were able to carefully follow these guidelines, and we submitted a single slide. This was February 2011. This started a fairly long and thorough review process that lasted for a year. And eventually, in February 2012, this proposal was selected as the next grand challenge for IBM Research. We started to work a few months later with a small team that gradually expanded. And after a little more than 6.5 years of intensive work, dedicated solely to this mission of developing a machine that can debate humans, we demonstrated the system for the first time to the general public in an event in San Francisco earlier this year. And it was a full live debate between this system, now being called Project Debater, and one of the legendary debaters in the history of university debate competitions, Mr. Harish Natarajan. And I think it was surprisingly reminiscent to the vision that we had on that single slide back in the office in Tel Aviv quite a few years earlier. And it was in front of a live audience of about 800 people, mainly journalists from all the top media outlets, and it was broadcasted live. And this event, this demonstration, received massive media exposure, 2.1 billion social media impressions. Those who heard me quote this number know that I'm always careful to say that I'm not 100% sure what a social media impression actually is. But it doesn't matter. Apparently, it is very good to have many. So this was good. And also a lot of video views and press coverage and so on. So what I'm going to do next is really to share with you just a few minutes out of this live debate. The full live debate is available on YouTube. I encourage all of you to watch that. But before that, here is the premise. So the debate starts with a motion that defines what we are debating. In this case, it was whether or not we should subsidize preschools. There are many considerations around how to select the debate topic, which I'm skipping now. I will just emphasize that obviously it is selected from a list, from an unseen set of topics, so the system is never trained or evaluated on this list. And we are on site government, so Project Debater, supports the motion. Harish is on the opposition. We have 4 minutes opening speeches, 4 minutes rebuttal speeches, and 2 minutes closing statements. So all in all, pauses included, we are talking about around 25 minutes of a discussion between man and machine. We will see 3 minutes out of that, and then we'll discuss the underlying technology. So we still need the audio. Try it again.
Greetings, Harish. I have heard you hold the world record in debate competition wins against humans, but I suspect you've never debated a machine. Welcome to the future. When we subsidize preschools and the like, we are making good use of government money because they carry benefits for society as a whole. For decades, research has demonstrated that high-quality preschool is one of the best investments of public dollars, resulting in children who fare better on tests and have more successful lives than those without the same access. Secondly, a few words about poverty. While I cannot experience poverty directly and have no complaints concerning my own standards of living, I still have the following to share. Regarding poverty, research clearly shows that a good preschool can help kids overcome the disadvantages often associated with poverty. The OECD has recommended that government subsidize pre-primary education to boost performance in poor areas.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here for this historic event. And it certainly was a pleasure to listen to Project Debater. There was a lot of information in that speech, and lots of facts and lots of figures. The problem, though, is the reality of subsidizing preschools is one which does not deal with the underlying problems in society. If you massively increase the number of people going to preschool, they're all going to be the ones going to the high-quality preschools. In a competitive environment at the age of 3 or 4, when you're learning that that other child is potentially better than you, when you realize you aren't necessarily as talented as someone else, that huge psychological damage for many children may mean that preschool is actively harmful.
Among other things, I think Mr. Natarajan suggested that preschools should not be subsidized because this will reduce their quality. I would like to offer a different view. I disagree with my opponent. Subsidizing preschools will have no negative effect on their quality. If anything, the opposite is true. One of many reasons is that subsidizing attracts more skilled and qualified people to the field, improving the quality of preschools for all. My opponent claimed that preschools are harmful. I believe my argument suggested that the benefits outweigh the potential disadvantages. I touched upon 3 issues: children, students, and crime. Specifically, I noted that preschool education improves children's development. In addition, I suggested that attending preschool helps students succeed. And a final point to consider is that preschool can prevent future crime. We should subsidize preschools. Thanks for your attention.
So this is just 3 minutes. Again, I encourage you to watch the full live debate on YouTube. And I think a fair question at this stage is how this system actually works. The short answer is given in this slide. So let me take you through that step by step. Over the years, we published quite a few papers. But typically, each paper is highlighting only one aspect of the system. And in the next few minutes, I will try to some extent to connect the dots. So the system has two major sources of information. One of them is a massive corpus with close to 10 billion sentences coming from around 400 million newspaper articles. And we start by pre-processing these data, build an index at the sentence level, do some cleansing, add some annotations. And importantly, we also wikify the entire data. That is, we try to find the Wikipedia concepts mentioned in each and every sentence in these data. And as you can imagine, right, if we are debating whether to subsidize preschools, it is quite useful to be able to identify all the sentences that mention the concept of preschool, even using different surface forms, like children's nursery or pre-primary education. But in order to do that, we need a wikification algorithm, which is, first of all, very efficient, so we will be able to wikify billions of sentences. It should be fairly accurate, so we can use it. And finally, it should also cover Wikipedia concepts that are not necessarily classical named entities, like preschools or autonomous cars or affirmative action, all classical debate topics. So the first thing that we did in this context is to develop label data that will allow us to develop and evaluate these algorithms. And the first paper that I mentioned, led by Yossi Mas, describes a data like that, thousands of sentences, very carefully annotated for all the Wikipedia concepts that they mentioned. So if you have interest in this field, I encourage you to take a look. And then eventually we converge naturally to a very simple and efficient algorithm. This is described in another paper led by Ilya Schneiderman. And what was surprising about this algorithm is that on the one hand, it's simple and efficient. It basically relies on exploiting the redirects in Wikipedia. But it is also very accurate compared to other systems in the field. This argument was not convincing enough to all the reviewers who got the opportunity to review this paper over the years, sometimes again and again. So eventually we gave up and just placed it on the archive. But still, I think this is an interesting work to take a look and compare your system to if you work on that. Now, when the debate actually starts, several underlying components come into action. And the paradigm that we defined and try to follow is that we will search for short pieces of text that satisfy three criteria. They should be relevant to the topic. They should be argumentative in nature, that is, argue something about the topic, not just relevant. And finally, they should support our side of the debate. So we spend quite a lot of time and effort on trying to do that, just that. And we published quite a few papers along these lines. I mentioned just a few of them here. The first paper is a paper led by Ran Levy in Calling 2014, really the first paper to pose the problem of context-dependent claim detection. That is, finding claims in a corpus in the context of a controversial topic. The second paper, led by Ruti Rinot, a year later in EMNLP, was basically doing the same for evidence. And recently, we revisited that using new techniques like BERT. This is a paper led by Liat Endor, who is in the audience, and it is still under review, and I will elaborate on this work and some interesting results that we got later on. In addition, we need to understand the stance, right? We need to understand whether an argument is supporting our side or supporting the opponent. And this part of the system, the development of this part of the system was led by Roy Bar Chaim from our team. Again, we published quite a few papers, and I mentioned one key reference led by Roy, published in EACL 2 years ago, and another work led by Orit Toledo-Ronen from our team, which I think is nice. It's kind of, it was in calling last year, and it really using a nice trick in order to automatically construct sentiment lexicons of unigrams and also of bigrams by considering and exploiting a massive corpus. So I think this is worth noticing as well. And the second major source of information of the system is a unique knowledge graph that we constructed over the years that contains thousands of argumentative, more principled argumentative elements that were actually written, authored by expert team members. And when the debate starts, the system is starting to navigate, so to speak, in this knowledge graph, aiming to find the most relevant principled arguments and use them in the right timing. So the development of this part of the system was led by Jonathan Bilu, also in the audience, and a paper describing some of this work was published earlier this year in ACL. I will elaborate on that also later on, but just to give you a concrete example, what we mean by a principled argument. So imagine that we are debating whether or not to ban the sale of alcohol or whether or not to ban organ trade. In both cases, the opposition may argue that if we ban something, we are at the risk of the emergence of a black market. Okay, so a black market is, and a black market has a lot of negative implications and so on. So this is kind of a principled argument that we understand that can be used in many different debates. And one may naively think that this is just a keyword matching thing, right? If we ban something, then the opposition may use the black market argument, but as I'm sure many of you can appreciate, this is more complicated than that. So imagine a debate about whether we should ban breastfeeding in public. Chances are that the opposition will not argue about a black market in this case, or a debate about banning internet cookies. Again, probably we will not see the emergence of a black market of internet cookies due to that. So the system really needs to develop a more subtle understanding of language in order to really perform in this task and find the relevant principled arguments. Now, of course, after all that, we need to do rebuttal. We need somehow to respond to the opponent. And this starts by being able to identify the words articulated by the opponent. And for that purpose, we use the Watson speech recognition capabilities out of the box. But of course, we need to go beyond the words, right? We need somehow to understand the gist of the opponent's speech and the main claims that the opponent is using. And to that end, we use several techniques that rely more or less on the same principle. We try to anticipate in advance what kind of claims the opposition may use, and then listen to determine whether indeed the opposition was making these claims, and if so, try to respond accordingly. So the first work along these lines is a work led by Matan Orbach, and this is actually a paper that will be presented in the poster session on Thursday. And as you can imagine, right, if we can find principled arguments that support our side of the debate, presumably we can also find principled arguments that support the opposition side, and then listen to see whether the opposition was making these claims, and then generate a response. Another paper along these lines, led by Shahar Mirkin and published in EMNLP last year, is trying to find the opposition claims in debate portals. This is also tricky because perhaps the phrasing of the motion that we got is different from the phrasing of the motion in the debate portal. We need somehow to be able to do the matching. But of course, the main limitation of that approach is that many debates are not covered in the debate portal. Okay, so only a small fraction will be covered there. And indeed, in the debate with Arish Natarajan, this module was not used. And A third approach is really using the corpus. So if we can find claims supporting our side in the massive corpus, presumably we can also find claims supporting the opposition, and then listen to see whether the opposition are making these claims. And if so, try to find an evidence that will counter the claim and use that. This is very, very challenging, actually. And a paper describing that, led by Tamar Lavie, who is also in the audience, was presented in the argument mining workshop earlier this year in ACL. Now, in addition, in some cases, we would like to find content that mentions concepts that were not mentioned explicitly in the motion phrasing, right? So imagine that we are debating whether or not the pros and cons of the two-party system in the US, right? In this particular debate, we may want to use content discussing the alternative, right? The multi-party system. And we need somehow to automatically understand that the multi-party system is the alternative to the two-party system, or to understand that cryptocurrency is relevant and is an extension of the notion of Bitcoin. Okay, so a paper describing this part of the system, led by Roy Bar Chaim, was published earlier this year. And finally, I thought of mentioning just a few more papers, a subset from the papers that we published. Also, since some of them release data, which I think is interesting to this community. So first of all, as you can imagine, we needed also to develop some underlying NLP capabilities, for example, in the context of semantic relatedness. And here I mentioned two papers, one of them led by Ran Levy in ACL a few years ago, describing interesting data, 10,000 pairs of multi-word expressions very carefully annotated for their semantic relatedness. And a follow-up paper in LREC last year led by Liat Endor, describing and releasing another data of 16,000 pairs of Wikipedia concepts carefully annotated for their semantic relatedness. So if you work on semantic relatedness methods, I think these data are worth considering. In addition, after we find the claims and evidence, we need somehow to arrange them in a meaningful manner into meaningful paragraphs. And in order to do that, we used cluster analysis. And one paper in this context, led by Liat Endor, was published in ACL last year. And another paper talking about thematic clustering of short text, a very interesting problem, led by Asaf Toledo from our team, is currently under review. And finally, in order to develop and evaluate the rebuttal capabilities of the system, we recruited a small team of in-house debaters, human debaters in this case, and we asked them to record debate speeches. And over the years, we collected around 3,000 debate speeches, and we are now in the process of writing a paper to release these data. This is a paper that hopefully will be submitted to ACL, led by Matan Orbach. And we actually consider an intriguing problem in this context. So we start with the opening speech, and then we consider a few rebuttal speeches for the same motion. Only one of them is really answering the opening speech. Okay? So for humans, when they read that, it's fairly easy to identify which speech is answering the opening. For machines, this is quite difficult as far as we understand. So we thought this is an interesting problem and also quite interesting data to share with the community. So this was a high-level description of the entire system, all the papers and all the data sets that I mentioned, and also other data sets are available through our website. And what I'm going to do next is really to zoom in on a specific paper, corpus-wide argument mining, led by Liat Endor. So the problem is the following problem. We are given a controversial topic, and we need somehow to pinpoint pieces of evidence in a massive corpus that are relevant to this topic. Okay? And this is very challenging. Okay, let me give you an example. So let's say that we are debating whether blood donation should be mandatory or not. We see here two sentences. Okay, the first sentence essentially conveys that blood donation is good for your health. Okay, and this can be used as evidence during this debate, and correspondingly, all the annotators who consider this particular sentence confirmed it as usable evidence in this debate, so the labeling score is 1. The second sentence is essentially telling us that students are kind of common amongst blood donors. Okay? So this is relevant, but this is not very persuasive, and correspondingly, only 40% of the annotators confirm that as usable evidence in this debate. So the system, but when we read that, right, where is the signal? The system needs somehow to automatically understand that we can use the first one, but not the second one. This is another example of a very important debate, whether we should abandon Valentine's Day or not. And in the first sentence, it talks about a survey done in Canada, where apparently most Canadians in a relationship thinks that we can abandon it, and it is basically a waste of time and money. And this was confirmed by all the annotators, so the labeling score is high. And this is another sentence, another survey done in the US, conveying that most of people in a relationship, if they are going to break up with someone, they are going to do it just before Valentine's Day to save money, which is probably a useful piece of information, but not very usable in this particular debate, and correspondingly, it gets a labeling score of only 30%. And again, when we read that, we see that something is happening, but the system needs to automatically capture that and use the first one and not the second one. Now, this issue of this problem of argument mining, the first papers date back to 2012 or so. But since then, there are really a lot of works on that and a lot of papers being published. We published a few papers. There is a paper by Lippi and Toroni. There are very interesting papers coming from the team of Benno Stein. I mentioned here El-Khatib et al. And Washmush et al. Also very interesting papers coming from the team of Irina Gurevich. I mentioned two of them led by Christian Stab. There are too many to list here, and I really encourage you to take a look at several excellent recent reviews that were published covering this rapidly emerging field. And the main distinctions of the work, the present work that I'm talking about from previous work is that, first of all, this is really, to our understanding, the first description of an end-to-end solution, starting from the queries and reporting results over a massive corpus. In addition, we took a sentence-level strategy as opposed to a document-level strategy taken in previous papers. So in principle, we may end up bringing evidence from hundreds, even thousands of documents. And of course, there is the issue of scale, right? So in terms of scale, first of all, in the development and training data of the system, we consider 240 debate topics. In the evaluation set, we had 100 debate topics. This is a lot compared to what was done in previous studies. In addition, over the years, we collected around 200,000 sentences that were carefully annotated in the context of this task. And I will talk a little bit about how you collect such large data to train and develop your system. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, we report results over a really massive corpus of billions of sentences, which is really different from reporting results over finding evidence in 10 documents, 20 documents, or even 50 documents. So I think the one important message in this work is that we are now closer than ever to a working solution. And I think this reflects about the maturity of the technology, of this kind of technologies to be really usable in our day-to-day life. So the architecture of the system is not very surprising. We have the corpus. We receive as query a controversial topic. And then we have a set of queries that are being specified through this controversial topic. And then we bring candidate evidence, a long list of sentences. We can end up with 10,000, 20,000 sentences, so we still need somehow to rank them, and we use BERT trained over the label data that I mentioned to rank the sentences, aiming to have the real evidence at the top of the list. And of course, the question is, how do you collect such label data? And I think this is very challenging for various reasons, right? First of all, the prior of positive examples in the data is fairly low. So if you just go ahead and label sentences at random, even sentences that mention the topic, the power is kind of 2%, right, of positive examples. So this is not feasible. And moreover, you will end up with an extremely unbalanced label data. Okay, so you need to do something else. In addition, this labeling task is kind of subtle and kind of complex. Doing that in the crowd is very difficult, so we needed to develop special expertise in this context. And I would just mention, by the way, that when we get inter-annotator agreement, kappa values of 0.4, these are actually quite good for this kind of task. So I think people need to recognize that, kappa values that we get really depend on the task, right? So for some tasks, you should expect 0.6 or 0.7. For this kind of tasks, actually 0.4 is very good, and the data is certainly usable and valuable. And in addition, if you're going to develop a system for corpus-wide argument mining, then there are practical problems that you need to consider. So let's say that you're going to evaluate the system over 100 topics, okay? And you're labeling the top 100 predictions in each topic. So you took the burden and you labeled 10,000 predictions. But then you change something in the system, okay? So you get 20% new predictions. Now you have 2,000 new predictions you need to label, and in the next week, this may happen again. So we need some kind of an infrastructure that will allow us to do that. And the architecture team in the debater team developed this kind of infrastructure, which was very cool. Basically, you press a button, you go home, you show up in the next day, and the 2,000 new predictions are labeled. So this led to a highly efficient development cycle that we used over the years. Of course, this was only one out of many, many things that this incredible architecture team contributed to the project over the years. And all this naturally led us to what we call retrospective labeling paradigm of labeling the top predictions. And this is explained in the following slide. So you start with a model. In our case, we started from the model described in a paper led by Ruti Rinot. This model is not good enough for a live debate, but the precision of the top predictions is kind of 30%, much better than random. Okay, so you label the top predictions. Now you get label data, which is fairly large and more or less balanced. You can use it to build an even better model and label again the top predictions and continue in iterations like that to gradually improve the results. And eventually, these are the results that we get. So these are results for various BERT models. And as you can see, the top model obtains precision of around 95% over the top 40 predictions. And this is average over 100 topics. Okay, so these are really exceptional results. We haven't seen anything like that in the past or in previous studies. So this is also quite interesting to observe that you can get this quality of results in this very challenging problem. And if we go back to the examples that I mentioned earlier, we see that BERT indeed nicely distinguishes between these two sentences, and also for the second example. So in the next few minutes, I will talk a little bit about this other part of the system, this knowledge graph of principled arguments that I mentioned earlier. And recall the motivation is really to try and capture the commonalities between the many different debates that humans are having. So think about it for a minute. I think many of us share the intuition that we and others sometimes use the same argument in different contexts, but with only small variations, right? And we certainly saw that expert debaters do that. But to capture that in a formal manner is quite ambitious and quite challenging, and this is what we tried to do in this work, led by Jonathan Bilu. So we defined the notion of argument classes, okay? So an argument class is essentially defined by the principled arguments that it contains, okay? So you see an example here for a class we refer to as technology. One principled argument is talking about, supporting the notion of using new technology. The other one is contesting the notion of using new technology, okay? And of course, there could be additional argumentative elements in the class, and there are many classes like that, okay? And on the other hand, we have the motions, right? And the key question is, how do you map from a motion to the relevant classes, okay? The classes that contain the principled arguments that can be used for this particular motion, okay? And the mapping is really far from trivial, especially bearing in mind that we have at the order of 50 classes on the one hand and many, many motions on the other hand. So in this context, we developed an ensemble of classifiers. Actually, the best one between them was a logistic regression. We got fairly good results, so I'm not going into the details. You are welcome to take a look at the paper to learn about it in more detail. But this was a very important part of the system and certainly usable, very effective in a full live debate. Taking a step back, another perspective about what we needed to accomplish is to develop three important capabilities. One of them we refer to as data-driven speech writing and delivery, okay? So think about the opening speech of the system. It is a 4-minute speech, around 700 words, okay? Quite somewhat reminiscent to an opinion article that you may read in the newspaper, but this one was written by the system in a completely automatic manner on a topic it was never trained upon before. So I'm sure you can appreciate this is far from trivial. The second part, listening comprehension or rebuttal. So we can compare that to the personal assistants that we have on our smartphones, which typically rely on quite powerful AI technology. These personal assistants usually need to listen and understand a single sentence with a functional flavor, all right? Like, turn off the lights, find me a restaurant nearby, or something like that. The debater is in a different situation, right? Needs to listen to the opponent for a few minutes. The opponent is speaking fast, with a lot of emotion, raising ethical considerations and moral arguments. Still, we need to understand the gist of that in order to make a meaningful response, which is quite challenging. And finally, there is the issue of modeling human dilemmas. This is the principled arguments and the knowledge graph that I mentioned earlier. And of course, the issue is that for the system to be able to perform in a live debate, many, many components need to perform well simultaneously, right? So this is a key problem. And the problem really is that many things can go wrong. Right? Many things can go wrong, sometimes in unexpected ways. So, for example, if you fail to identify the stance of the argument, you are going to argue in favor of your opponent, which is not a recommended tactic based on our own experience. In addition, you may drift from the topic, right? So some of our team members remember a debate that we had in 2016 between the system at the early stages and a human debater. The debate was about whether physical education should be compulsory, and the debater system was arguing in passion about sex education. The human debater was trying to bring it back to the topic in vain. This was quite an amusing experience for some of the people in the audience and disturbing for some other people in the audience. But anyhow, that was that. And in addition, the system is only as good as its corpus, right? So you see here a short piece of text, perhaps in the context of global warming, but malaria is not a virus. It is caused by a parasite, and the system cannot really correct something like that. Also, as I'm sure many people in the audience know, it is hard to detect sarcasm. So we see here another sentence talk about university scientists, but the system really don't see that, right? So it can miss the point completely. Also, using topic tags could be tricky. So we use these topic tags to rephrase a little bit some of the principled arguments that we use. So for example, if the debate is about whether we should ban gambling, instead of saying people enjoy that, therefore we should attempt to fix it rather than eliminate it, we may say people enjoy gambling, therefore we should attempt to fix it rather than eliminate it, which is good, it makes sense. But in theory, you may end up saying people enjoy assisted suicide, therefore we should attempt to fix it rather than eliminate it, which is probably less effective in some debates. And also the issue of debate topic expansion is challenging. So finding the alternatives sometimes work well. For example, let me discuss a welcome alternative to surrogacy. This is adoption, so this is nice. But imagine a debate about whether we should fight global warming. And then we have, let me discuss a welcome alternative to global warming. This is global cooling. So again, this is not ideal. Or let me discuss an alternative to suicide, which has some advantages. This is homicide, which is, again, not ideal if you're going to demonstrate your system in front of many journalists. But still, we were able to make progress. So the first live debates that we had were in 2016. After nearly 4 years of work. The system was really at the toddler level at the time. And in 3 years, I think it made it to a decent university level debater, which was interesting to see. If we consider individual components of the system, we also see very significant improvement over the years. So by the end of 2015, the macro average precision of the claim detection module was only 20%, which was certainly disturbing. This was after 3 years of work. In 2016, we saw significant improvement due to several reasons. First of all, we started to work on data beyond Wikipedia, on much larger data, and we started to annotate data in the crowd, and we started to use deep learning techniques. And by the end, in 2019, we get these results. So it's interesting to see this very positive gradient over the years. But of course, the real question is, how do you evaluate the performance of such a system as a whole? Right? It is not enough to evaluate the individual components. And think about it for a minute. This is tricky, right? Because you need to bring human debaters, and you need the system, and you need to bring an audience, and you need to pick motions. How many times you can repeat doing something like that, right? So obviously we did that over the years, but this does not scale, right? So you need to do something else, and the approach that we took is to define an evaluation set of 80 debate topics. And then we had an in-house team of annotators. And for each debate topic, we were sending the annotators 3 speeches, okay? The opening speech by the current version of the system, an opening speech by the opposition, by a human, actually not referring to our own speech, but this didn't really matter, and then a rebuttal speech by the current version of the system, referring to the opening speech by the human, okay? And they were asked several questions, like what is the overall performance of the system, the quality of the opening speech, the quality of the rebuttal speech, and so on. And they were asked to give a score between 1 to 5. And we see how the system is gradually improving over the years. And again, these are average performance over all 80 topics. The variance is quite significant. So in some topics, the system will perform well. In some topics, the system may miss the issue completely. So we thought these are fairly good results. Now, in the next few minutes, I would like to talk what we were doing since the demonstration of the live debate in February. So first of all, this work should be perceived as part of a larger journey taken by IBM Research, aiming to develop technologies that eventually will be able to master human language. The mission of the debater team in this context is really to develop technologies, language technologies, that will allow to enhance decision-making in enterprises. So when we face a decision, this means that actually we face a complex question that do not have a simple factual answer. Right? What it has are pros and cons that need to be carefully considered. So what do people do in this context? One possibility is to go and read the relevant documents and search for arguments there. And I already mentioned the argument mining technologies that we developed in this context. The other possibility is to consult. You can consult with your friends, with your peers, with your colleagues, and with your family, and ask them for arguments. Right? So with that in mind, we started to consider an interesting use case that we call speech by crowd. So the question that we posed was, can we generate concise, compelling, meaningful narratives out of thousands of arguments contributed by many different individuals? Okay? And what are the challenges for doing something like that? So first of all, we need to automatically understand if a contributed argument is supporting or contesting the topic, so we can place it in the right narrative. And we need also to to anticipate that different people may contribute the same argument only using different words, different phrasing. So we need to identify these paraphrases and avoid redundancy in the narrative. And we need to identify the underlying themes that spontaneously emerge from all the individual contributions. And finally, we need somehow to capture this vague but very important notion of argument quality. Okay? So often when we show people two arguments, they will agree that one is better than the other. But what are the underlying mechanisms that guide us to prefer one argument over the other? And how do we capture that in a formal algorithm? These are the kind of questions that we need to address. We have a working prototype that we demonstrated in various venues. We had an interesting live demonstration in Tel Aviv just a few months ago in front of a live audience of 1,500 people. We posed the topic. It was whether the government should legalize cannabis. And in just 1 hour, we collected around 1,000 arguments and used the system on the fly, on stage, to generate the narratives and play them to the audience, which was quite interesting. And in addition, we are going to have another demonstration just 2 weeks from now in Cambridge, UK. We're going to have a debate about whether AI will bring more harm than good. And we're going to collect arguments from the crowd, from many different people, like the community in Cambridge. And then the system will generate the opening speeches for both sides. And then the debate will proceed with humans, 2 top AI experts who kindly volunteered to participate, and 2 expert debaters who volunteered to participate, including Harish. So we think that this is going to be quite an interesting event. And by the way, you can actually go to this link and try it for yourself. Try the interface of the system and contribute arguments. You will see that the system is kind of trying to predict whether you are contributing a supporting argument or a contesting argument and place it in the right side. And if you will contribute a high-quality argument, perhaps the system is going to use it in the debate in 2 weeks from now. But of course, beyond these demonstrations, we think of real use cases for this speech by crowd. So think about a company that would like to collect feedback from clients or customers, thousands of clients and customers about a product or a service. Think about an employer that would like to gain feedback from the employees, or a government that would like to collect, to hear the voice of the citizens about policies being considered. And speech by crowd, so we think it has a lot of interesting implications, and basically it can help to establish a communication channel, an effective communication channel between the decision maker and people that might be impacted by the decision. And this, in particular, led us to consider in more detail the notion of argument quality. And there are several, actually this draws a lot of attention recently, so there are several interesting works in this field. Of course, the challenge is that the notion of quality of an argument is inherently subjective, so this is quite difficult to collect label data for these tasks. We have 2 papers. One of them will be presented in the poster session on Thursday, and there is another work which is currently under review. So the first paper is led by Asaf Toledo, and the second paper led by Shai Gretz from our team, currently under review, where we collected, I think, very interesting label data, 30,000 arguments contributed by the crowd and annotated for their quality by the crowd, different people, of course. So hopefully this will be published soon and released to the community. All this is happening under the umbrella of a rapidly emerging field of computational argumentation. You see here the number of hits in Google Scholar for papers that mention argument mining or argumentation mining over the years, and we see nice progress. If you look at the titles of papers in the top NLP conferences, again, when I looked, I saw around 3 papers in 2014 and 30 papers in the same conferences in 2019, which is certainly encouraging. So just before closing, I think it is worth asking why to pursue a grand challenge to begin with, if this is so difficult. So several answers. First of all, it helps us to advance science. Over the years, we published nearly 40 papers, released many data sets to the community. Also, we participate in organizing workshops, tutorials. There's going to be a tutorial on debater and related technologies in AACL, so everybody are welcome. And of course, it helps to pioneer research on new questions. I mentioned the issue of context-dependent claim detection and evidence detection that I think received little attention until these papers, also the work on principled arguments and rebuttal. And finally, of course, there are many practical use cases for this technology. So we are actually developed a platform, an extendable and scalable platform that contains debater services, and we're going to start using that next month with selected customers. And we also sometimes think about this metaphor of a lighthouse in the dark. It really helps you to focus, the fact that you have this long-term focused goal and you need to take a decision. You know I need to get there, and I'm considering whether to invest time in this research question or this research question. It is really helpful to be able to say, well, what is going to help me to reach to that goal? So this was a metaphor that we had back in the back of our minds. And to wrap up, I want to go back to the notion of grand challenges. So grand challenges in artificial intelligence are really there from day one. Right? So back in the 50s, Arthur Samuel from IBM, the person who actually coined the term machine learning, was developing this software that can play checkers. It looks trivial to us today, but back then it was a real sensation. In the 80s and early 90s, Jerry Tesauro, one of the fathers of reinforcement learning, also from IBM Research, still in IBM Research, developed this software that can play backgammon. Chess in the 90s, and more recently, AlphaGo from DeepMind. But I would like to suggest that all these board games really lie in what I refer to as the comfort zone of artificial intelligence. So let me make a few observations in this context. So first of all, when a board game is done, we know who won the game. And this has important implications because it means we can use reinforcement learning techniques to improve the system. In addition, in board games, we typically can define a scoring function that provides a quantitative score for any position, any scenario on the board. And again, we intuitively understand that we can exploit that in order to span the tree of the game. And since we understand the score of any scenario, we can play effectively using the computational power of the system. And finally, in board games, at least in the complex board games, the AI can sometimes defeat humans using tactics that humans do not even comprehend. So we see that the AI is taking a move, And nobody, not even the top experts, really understand what happened. Only 5 or 10 moves later, we understand when this is already too late. All these observations are not true for a debate. Okay? So when a debate is done, we do not necessarily know who won the debate. It is not even clear how to define that in some cases. We don't have an inherent scoring function that we can use to quantify the situation in any point in time during the debate. And finally, it is pretty hard to win a debate using tactics that humans cannot follow. Rather, the system needs somehow to adjust to human rationale and logic in order to even just participate in the debate in a meaningful manner. So debater is certainly not in the comfort zone of artificial intelligence. It is in a different territory, in a territory where humans are still better, humans still prevail, but this is good because this means that we have many open questions, many interesting questions to continue and investigate. So let me just end by thanking the incredible team of the debater team in IBM Research. It is really a privilege, an honor, and a lot of fun working with all of you. And I will pause here. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Noam, for the wonderful talk. And we have only 5 minutes for question answering. Any questions?
Hi, thanks for a super impressive collection of papers that you described so in one talk. Can you say something about multi-step arguments, generating them, recognizing them, and rebutting them? So just to take an example from the talk, by itself, the fact that most blood is donated by students is not relevant. But somebody might be able to make an argument that this is exploiting a vulnerable population or polluting the blood supply with less educated blood or incompletely educated blood or something else.
Yeah, this is a good question. So the system is certainly not at the level of developing, logic like humans can do, right? So humans usually, they have some kind of a clear rationale, and they develop the argument, a more complex argument step by step. And the system is usually working at the sentence level. And for various reasons, we limited ourselves to work at the sentence level. What the system is trying to do is really to arrange that in an effective manner, okay? So it is not just a collection of sentences, arranged, in an arbitrary manner, but we arrange that into paragraphs. We also try to arrange, to have some templates that will arrange it within each paragraph so it will be more effective, right? So usually you start with a claim, and then you proceed with evidence. You try that the evidence will be most relevant to the claim, and so on. So this is, I would say, preliminary attempts to be able to mimic what humans are really doing.
Any more questions?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm Daniel. Is it still working? Yeah, cool. So kind of a follow-up question, and where do you see in general the role of logic in the future research of this kind, in the sense that would it be possible to decompose the claims and sort of construct logical chains, even sort of propositional logic like, or maybe go to implication and stuff like that in order to be able to do some kind of a change to lead to a certain argument?
I think this is an excellent open question. I think we didn't do that, not at that level. And I think, yes, I think it is doable. It will require a lot of work. I do want to say something, when we, obviously this takes an extractive approach, right? We take these pieces of text and then we glue them together into a narrative. But notice that to some extent the narrative that we get, even the paragraphs that we get, they represent to some extent new arguments, right? That were never stated in this form in the corpus. Okay, so we need also to bear that in mind. Okay, but what you are talking about, I think, is more ambitious and being able really to take the gist out of each claim and then build it into logic is, I think it's an interesting open question.
Okay, the last questions.
Thank you very much. We've been talking mostly about the logical side of things, and the two rhetorical divides mostly used in debates is the logos and the pathos. And I'm wondering if you do make an explicit distinction between the two, and if you're sort of approaching them sort of separately, and whether you have thoughts on that.
So yes, this is also a good point. So we have logos and pathos and ethos, right? So you can argue that the system has some kind of an ethos, right? It's an automatic system, and people recognize that, right? And the system actually presents itself as an automatic system. And also the humor, which is, the humoristic comments, also the subtext is that I'm a machine, right? So we do not try to be perceived as humans. So this is about the ethos, and it's an interesting question, how human perceive information received by an automatic system as opposed to received by a human. In addition, regarding pathos and logos, obviously the system is more focused on the logos side, but these questions are starting to get growing attention from the computational argumentation community. So there are teams actually working on these aspects of pathos. We didn't invest much time in that unless you count, again, the humoristic comments and also the voice of the system, which we made a lot of effort to make it sound more expressive, not too monotonic.
Okay, if you have more questions, please contact Noam offline, and we have to end this session. And let's thank the speaker again.
Thank you.